I think that a lot of the time, things change without our full awareness. Retrospect is clear cut, but present reality is foggier. You can fall in love quietly. You can fall out of love quietly. And some days you can wake up feeling like the world was different yesterday when you really just failed to notice all of the changes that had happened without your awareness. Despite my introspection that can border on overthinking, I fall victim to this too. I remember watching an assembly about the Columbine shooting in middle school and fearing that one day in the coming years, another Columbine would happen. Now I check Twitter and see the name of a city trending, and my first thought is, how many? Not wondering what happened, wondering how many people were killed this time. When I wrote this paragraph, there had been 271 mass shootings so far this year. I remember dancing in joy when gay marriage was legalized on the federal level. I had grown from watching people use gay as an insult to knowing I could marry a woman I was in love with if I wanted to. On May 17th of this year, Ron DeSantis signed into law that gender affirming care for minors is illegal, as well as other legislation that makes trans people going to the bathroom that matches their gender identity a crime. Hate crime statistical methods leave a great deal to be desired and most likely are way too low, but even the underreported numbers are concerning. The first time I voted in a major election was the 2016 election. I don't know if it's my age and level of naivety that makes me feel this way, but I feel like so much has happened in such a short amount of time. I don't think I realized just how much this had affected me until I was a passenger in a car that drove through the trucker protests in downtown Vancouver in early 2022. I got the impression by the news that this was shocking, but all I could think about was the intersection near my house that would be covered in Trump flags every Friday with counter protesters nearby. I just felt numb. I thought about how the version of me less than a decade ago would have reacted, her shock and her fear. I wondered when I had become disillusioned, when I had lost my hope, when I had begun to see the decay of basic human decency on a national scale as almost inevitable. I don't think that my experience is unique. I think it's quite common. We are bombarded with the worst humanity has to offer every day on our social media feeds and the 24-hour news cycle. We watch everything we fight for be systematically stripped away. It feels hopeless. We're burnt out. We have compassion fatigue. We're exhausted. I think we can all agree that that's awful. So, where do we go from here? Well, like my mother has always said, to defeat a beast, we have to understand it. What is burnout? It's defined by Mayo Clinic as a physical or emotional exhaustion that involves a sense of reduced accomplishment and loss of personal identity. It's typically associated with work, but can stem from any area of your life. It's often linked to depression because the signs sound very similar. And feelings of hopelessness, sleep issues, memory issues, fatigue, and overwhelming exhaustion. Depression differentiates in that removing stressors does not alleviate your symptoms. It also has emotional aspects that are rooted deeply in your perception of reality and can last for years. Whereas burnout has a specific cause, and when the stressor is removed, you should start to improve. Isn't that such a frustrating way to have to think about it, how to conceptualize it? Like, how do we know which one we're experiencing? Symptoms don't isolate themselves from context for perfect analysis and comparison. It's all just your life. I'm only giving advice on burnout today, so if you think you could have depression, I recommend seeking out a mental health professional. Let's move on to compassion fatigue. What is that? When we conceptualize fatigue, we commonly only view it in the context of physical exhaustion, but fatigue can show up in so many other areas of your functioning, like decision fatigue. If you make too many decisions in a short amount of time, the thought of having to make another decision sounds so exhausting. That's a type of fatigue. But compassion fatigue specifically is a series of symptoms that show up when you have a great deal of empathy, but are overwhelmed by the circumstances that you're in and feel unable to give enough to make it better. It feels like the burnout symptoms that I described, as well as the distress at the suffering of others and an anger at the reason that the suffering is happening. If you pour from an empty cup over and over again, you're going to get frustrated with yourself and the cup and whoever is keeping the water in short supply. It's natural. It makes perfect sense. Now, this can all build up into an awful monster called activism fatigue. It's a combination of the compassion fatigue, the burnout, and the mental health toll of living in a society that actively perpetuates inequality. If you're feeling frustrated at this barrage of physical symptoms and downsides of engaging in social justice work, I totally get it. I feel like a lot of people that want to do the work are in this cycle of engaging, feeling their nervous system flooded with all of those stress neurotransmitters, avoiding and then re engaging because they feel guilty about not doing enough. And it happens all over and over again. A cycle like clockwork. I've written the word overwhelming a lot in this, but it's hard to find a better word. Being constantly hit with, like I said, the worst that humanity has to offer and enough stories to break anyone's spirit. It's a heavy toll. I've heard people argue that our brains haven't evolved quickly enough to adapt to the sheer amount of information that goes into it every day. And I think that has some merit. This tendency toward avoidance behavior, though, it has me pretty worried. I don't think that complete eradication of stressors is a good way to go about it. Avoidance behavior can be satisfying in the short term, but reinforces the idea that avoiding your problems is a valid way to go about your life. Trust me when I say that is not an idea that you want to reinforce. Also, it's a disservice to the people that don't have the privilege to escape the reality of what our country does to marginalized people. We owe it to them to be the best version of ourselves by being the best help that we can be. So, what can we do about it? Because that's a lot. In moments where I feel overwhelmed, I think of a moment from when I was a child. I was able to clean very efficiently as a child. So, my mom would give me extra tasks around the house that involved cleaning because I loved it. The sense of accomplishment was fantastic. I made the house look better and I did something productive. The dopamine was a welcome benefit. It was all fine and dandy until my mother asked me to clean my brother's room one day. He had left it trashed. He was at that age where he'd pick something up and get bored instead of putting it away, leave it somewhere else and completely forget that it existed. I couldn't see more than a few square inches of floor space at a time. It was so overwhelming. The floor felt like a pile 20 feet high. There was no way that I could handle that. I wasn't good enough. I couldn't do enough. It was all just too much for me. So I went to my mother, feeling ashamed. I brought her to the room and I explained that it was way too big of a task for me to handle. And she laughed and said, "Of course you can handle it. You're such a good cleaner." So I gestured to the floor, like she had missed it or something. And she pointed over to a shelf in the back left corner and said, "That, right there. Pick up the stuff that's on the floor around the bottom of the shelf so you can stand there. Then you make sure all of the stuff on the shelf is in the right place. And then you move outward until you're at the laundry basket. Then you slowly branch out, and then before you know it, the whole floor is clear." And it worked. The room was spotless in what felt like no time, and I learned one of the most valuable lessons of my life. You can do so much more than you think is possible if you break it into smaller steps. I know what you're possibly thinking. That seems pretty reductive. How could I possibly view something as complex as social issues and inequality through such a simplified lens? That's fair. I definitely think that the road ahead of us is significantly more difficult than any dirty room. And the hatred and bigotry that harms marginalized people is nothing like a pile of forgotten toys. My example here isn't to minimize the severity in my framing, it's to talk about framing. Every single accomplishment that I have gotten in my life since that day has been because of that lesson. I live my life overwhelmed, but the smaller pieces help me get through. One person isn't going to save the whole world, but a world full of people who can only stare at the sheer size of the problem isn't going to fix it either. So let's break it into sections. Step one, focus the lens. Step two, listen to the experts. Step three, structure your goals. Step four, take care of yourself. Step five, take care of each other. Step six, celebrate everything. So let's start with step one, focus the lens. There is always going to be something else that you could be focusing on. I'm not in the business of ranking the importance of different awful things happening in the world because that would be awful. But I will say that there are certain issues that may feel closer to your heart. There are certain issues that you may have more of an ability to make a difference in, and there are issues that you may have the privilege to not experience. A privilege that you can use to help people that aren't in your position. I'm going to focus my efforts on anti racism work and queer liberation. I'm not saying you should completely ignore other issues, because of course you should sign the petitions and share them when it's time to do that, and have the hard conversations with people in your life. But focus most of your interest, focus most of your energy on something specific. Find that shelf in the back left corner of the room. Step two is to listen to the experts. If you were visualizing all of this in your mind, can you bold step two, listen to the experts? I cannot overemphasize how important this step is. Socrates once said that the only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. Leave your ego and your pride at the door. No one is done learning, ever. And the way to learn is with the experts. This fight has been going on long before we decided to join it, and they know a heck of a lot more than we do. So we sit down, and we close our mouths, and we listen. What you may hear could challenge your preconceived notions. Let it. A little cognitive dissonance is a more than fair price to be a more helpful person. If you skip this step, you will probably doing more harm than good. Nobody wants to be that obnoxious person who loudly shouts about how woke they are and tries to seem like they've done more than they've actually done. Plus, you're going to be burning yourself out on work that isn't actually doing that much good. Not a good look. If you need help finding resources, I'm pretty good at Googling things. I will use my Google powers for good if any of you need help with that. Now, step three is to structure your goals. In my career readiness courses a few years ago, I learned about a mnemonic acronym that helps you structure your goals in a more effective way. It's the letters to the word SMART. You need to make sure that your goal is specific. You need to make sure that it's something that you can track so that it's measurable. You need to keep the goal realistic because doing too much at once is overwhelming. Relevance is important so that you can stay on track. Time-based helps you make consistent progress without getting stuck on one action for too long. So that's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. Smart. And it is smart. Giving yourself concrete goals gives you that rush of dopamine, and that'll give you a sense of achievement, which is a solid motivation for future goals. Think about what you can do, what you can provide. Whatever it is that you're good at, there's probably some place that could use it. Play to your strengths. Work smarter, not harder. Step four is to take care of yourself. Existing under capitalism has a lot of drawbacks. I don't have the time to talk about all of the drawbacks, but I do want to mention a specific one: hustle culture. There's this pull yourself up by your bootstraps, push yourself harder, and whenever you take a break, your competitors are still working, and now you're behind mentality. It turns into this weird, suffering competition to see who has the least sleep, who's pushed themselves the hardest into an unhealthy workaholic territory, who is surviving on the least amount of self care. I've heard the phrase self care isn't selfish a lot, and I've said it quite a few times. I want to emphasize something slightly different, though. Self care is vital, not optional, required. You will not be okay without it. You cannot exist in social justice spaces without it. As appealing as the fantasy of complete self reliance and pushing yourself to the brink can be, it's not realistic. It's not sustainable. We're not Katniss Everdeen and we're not machines. We're not supposed to be. We are messy and alive and complicated, and we need to take care of ourselves and keep going. Another thing that I touched on earlier is to not fall into the avoidance trap. So take care of yourself so that you can exist in social justice spaces instead of just avoiding them and thinking that that's self care. It's all about balance. Pacing yourself and keeping an eye out for the signs of burnout, compassion fatigue, and activism fatigue, and all of the things that go with this space. Step 5 is to take care of each other. This is the one that I'm least worried about with us. One of the most valuable resources that I've had in my life when it comes to unlearning prejudice and becoming a better ally are friends who are also in that space and journey. Being able to bounce ideas off of each other and share things you've learned along the way makes everyone involved stronger. It's hard work, and talking to other people makes it so that you're less likely to get in your head. Plus, hearing hard truths from a kind source can make them easier to swallow. There's a proverb I'm sure you've all heard before: a trouble shared is a trouble halved. Imagine how much smaller that half could get if we all relied on each other. And the final step, step 6, is to celebrate any victory you can. I remember watching a recording of a training on combating anti trans legislation with other Mosaicans a while back. I remember that going into it, I was feeling pretty solemn. I mean, think of that topic. Anti trans legislation continues to be a topic on our minds and a pain that is heavy on all of our hearts. I expected watching the video to make me feel worse. Confronting the reality is typically painful, but the joy I saw in that video moves me to this day. The queer joy in that recording struck me deeply in a way that I didn't expect. Watching them banter with each other, have the inside jokes. I'm pretty sure I recall one of them mentioning that they had confetti in their office so that they could always celebrate. They mentioned that sometimes they were only able to celebrate for what felt like 20 minutes, but that they made every second count. We plant seeds when we try to make the world a better place. We hope that the people that follow will know how to water them. We never know. But every time we see a sprout or a watering can, I think we should cherish it. Because we're not alone in this. And 20 minutes of celebration can be the exact thing you need to keep going. And that's it. Those are my steps. With proper self care, I think we could put more effort into social justice without damaging our mental health. And self care can look different for everyone. You know the things that make you feel rejuvenated, that make you feel at ease, relaxed, calm, happy, all of those positive emotions. You know yourself better than I know you. It's just apply these steps in your own life. So there's this subfield in psychology called positive psychology that studies things in life that bring us joy and fulfillment. And in that field, there's a model created by Martin Seligman called the PERMA model that outlines vital facets to a happy life. And the M in that PERMA, the M in that model stands for meaning. We lift everyone up when we lift people up, and it's a meaningful thing to do. So much that it's seen as a vital part of happiness. A core part of why I love Unitarian Universalism is this idea that we can approach it with these different paths and beliefs, but feel unified in our acceptance and unconditional love of each other. But there's one specific belief that I think is relevant to my words today, and it's a belief that I think we all share. It's a belief in people. People can grow and change and find a renewable emotional energy. They can help without burning themselves away. I think I stopped believing in people for a while and gave in to the numb nihilist despair. But being surrounded by the light of this congregation has been so inspiring for me. So I hope that this has been inspiring for you, or at least given you something to think about. Thank you.